Thank you everyone for coming. I'm delighted to see so many of you here for today's talk with Loic. He is the Chief Research and Policy Officer for Innovations for Poverty Action, where his work is about championing research and evidence that is connected with real-world decision makers to improve the lives of people living in poverty. In practice, Loic oversees IPA's various sector programs, IPA's policy team, and IPA's Right Fit Evidence Unit, an advisory unit that helps funders and implementers with their own use of monitoring and evaluation, data, and evidence. In today's session, Loic will be presenting the concept of emerging innovations in international development, a.k.a. best bets, and going over 14 that IPA have identified in a recent flagship report. As a reminder, if you have questions for the speakers, we'll have 15-20 minutes for questions at the end of the session, so please submit them via the Swapcard app. You can also vote on other people's submissions. I'll select a mixture and present them to the speaker. There will also be office hours in Drake right after the session, so if there's stuff we don't have time to get to in this, come afterwards. Great. Well, without further ado, please welcome Loic.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. I really love, this is my second time in a EA conference, and it's just like the first time. I find it extremely energizing and gives me a lot of fuel for maybe the next 2 years before I come again. I work for IPA, as Shakil said. Most of you probably know about IPA, but for the few that don't, I'll do a 1-minute intro about what IPA does. So we do 3 main things out there. What we do is really, we are about evidence. So we are trying to create evidence and making sure it's used in the real world. That's, in a nutshell, what we're trying to do to improve the lives of people living in poverty. We do that with 3 different pillars in our strategy. The first one is the one that probably most of you know IPA for. Historically, that's what we started with, which is generate a lot of this rigorous evidence about what works and what doesn't. Often in partnership with academics, in a partnership with real-world organizations implementing real-world programs and trying to test what works and what works less well. That is well known, but what is less known, maybe even though it's been going quite a bit for us in the last 10 years, is the work of making sure this evidence gets used. So the second pillar is about making sure that the evidence gets in the right hand at the right time to influence real-world decision-making and programs and policies at scale. So, and it takes, an army of various policy staff in different country offices that we have that build relationship with policymakers, understand the budgeting process, and make sure to find the right spot to integrate evidence into the policymaking process. The third pillar is very closely connected to this second, and it's about not just creating the evidence, not just making sure it gets in the right hand at the right time, but also equipping organizations, whether it's government or funders or other types of implementers, NGOs and so on, to be generators and users of evidence themselves, to have those capacities internally to do all the stuff that you guys are very passionate about. Let's test things out, let's fail, let's iterate, let's use data to guide our decision making, and so on and so forth. So the third pillar is about helping other organizations to be learning organizations. A lot of this with government and some of it with other players. So that's in a nutshell about IPA. We've been at it for about 20 years. And I've been with IPA for almost 15 now. And in fact, I recently ran across a video of me giving a talk similar to here, smaller setting, but similar to here, 13, 14 years ago, soon after I started. And I don't know if people here have gone through this kind of experience of watching themselves give a talk 15 years earlier in their life. It's quite painful. But my first thought, my main thought on this, actually, my first thought is not relevant to this talk, but I'll still give it. My first thought, to be honest, was, okay, you look different. You should probably get back to putting exercise as part of your daily routine a bit more. That was my first thought, transparent here. But the main thought that is relevant for that talk that I had when I was watching me was that at the time, 13, 14 years ago, all that I was talking about was we don't have evidence. We don't know what works. There's very little rigorous evidence. We just need more of those RCTs, guys. And please come on board. Let's test things out, and then we'll know, and the world will be a better place. That's what I was talking about 13, 14 years ago. And now I think the world looks quite different. And I can show that here. We witnessed a very large increase in the generation of evidence, of rigorous evidence, in the international development sector. You can see that on the graph. This is not the graph of the capability of AI or whatever. This is actually the graph of the amount of impact evaluations that were published every year relevant to global development as per the 3IE portal. So basically, in the last 5 years of this graph, there is as much impact evaluation that was generated than in the previous 25 years. So we are really in a very different place than when I was giving that talk 13, 14 years ago. That's the good news. Now, the less good news is that the number of evidence-based programs operating at scale hasn't experienced nearly the same amount of growth. Some examples of interventions that are backed by strong evidence and are operating at scale are here on the screen. I'm showing those that IPA has been more directly involved with. You have the malaria bed nets. We were part of the early RCTs on this, and all of you know about this, I'm sure. You have unconditional cash transfers. We also heard about this yesterday for those who were in Rory's talk. That's operating at pretty large scale. The graduation approach is another one. It's this program that was initially created by BRAC, where you give an asset to ultra-poor people. It's really targeting the ultra-poor and trying to get them out of poverty. And you give them an asset, you give them training for how to use the asset. Could be a cow, could be goats. And on top of this, you give them regular cash transfers for a year or two to make sure that they don't sell the asset and make use of it. You also give them a bit of regular coaching. So this is a bit of a package of intervention that is now operating at reasonable scale in a lot of different places. And another one is teaching at the right level, here in the middle. Again, probably most of you are familiar with this. We heard about this a little bit this morning. This is about building foundational literacy and numeracy skills by grouping children by ability level, as opposed to by grade or age. Maybe I'll zoom a little bit into this. So those are a few examples that exist. There are not many more. I'll come back to that, to the fact that there are not many more of this, despite the very large increase in the amount of evidence there is out there. But I'll zoom in a little bit on that last example, just to give you a sense of maybe a bit of what it takes to get to that established level that I'm describing here, where you have an evidence-backed intervention that is truly operating at very large scales and reaching millions. This example I just talked about, so this was initiated, teaching at a level was a model initiated by Pratham in India. Maybe 25 years ago they started, for maybe 30. And they did some early RCTs with JPAL, and they found that grouping kids by ability level as opposed to by grade was an effective way to get them to improve on their foundational skills. Very exciting, nice, but it took 2 decades for it to really take up in a very large scale. It took a lot of different studies, some in India, with adaptation of the program to the government systems, iteration on it, because the first version of it in the government didn't work, the second version worked a bit better, the third version worked even better. Similarly, going to Africa, that's where IPA was involved, testing adapted version to the Ghanaian context with the Ghanaian government, and again, iterating 2 different RCTs in Ghana on different types of versions of the program operating at larger scale. And only now in Ghana, after 10 years of work in Ghana, plus 20 years in India before then, or or 15 years in India before then. Only now we are at a stage where their teaching under law is reaching about half of the schools in Ghana with technical assistance provided to make sure that it's operating as well as possible at scale. So basically the point I'm making here is that a lot of what here we're focusing on in those settings are what are those widgets, what are those TAL as of 20 years ago, when in fact a lot of the work is in those 20 years. So getting the initial idea, tinkering on it, adapting it to new context, trying to make it more scalable, integrating it with the systems, so research, advocacy, implementation, and lots of iteration. And that is the work that we think is not happening nearly enough in our space. So coming back to the number of evidence-based programs operating at scale, I'm showing 4 of them here. There's a few more in the annex of the report, and there are a few more out there that we didn't catch, but the number is not very large. So one of the reasons is, of course, that it's not just the research, it's about convincing funders, it's about convincing policymakers. Not all of them decide on the programs they operate or fund at scale based on evidence. But even when this is the motivation to use evidence is not a problem, even if you give well and you want to put evidence at the center of your decision making, you just don't have that many ripe programs that you can put dollars into with confidence that they're actually going to be able to effectively operate at scale cost effectively. And so there's the need to identifying and developing other solutions, other interventions. And there are many problem areas where you don't have an established solution right now that anyone would say we can confidently put money into and it will generate cost-effective impact at scale. So there is a strong interest in the community to identify those additional areas. There's a few quotes here on the screen. But that's kind of what motivated what the Best Bet report is doing. And I think the reason we think there's not so many of those is because of a bit of a missing middle in the funnel of developing innovations and putting them towards scale. You have very nice aligned incentives at the two ends of the spectrum here. At the low end of the spectrum, the proof of concept, impact evaluations, test a new fancy solution. There is a lot of interest there. There's a lot of this is where academic incentives, among others, are very strong. Find a new solution, prove it works. There's a lot of this stuff is happening, and that's a lot of what is. IP is doing a lot of this stuff, and we think it's very important and useful. There's still so many problems that just don't have any solution that we can get behind. That even just testing innovations is very useful. And that's, in fact, a lot of the growth in the evidence is driven by those kinds of studies out there. At the opposite end of the spectrum, the folks that are pushing and driving for those things are indeed the funders who want to have solutions that are ready. If you talk to the Minister of Education in Ghana again, they're going to want to hear from you what the solution is that is ripe and ready and safe. And to some extent, some aspects of GiveWell approach is also similar. But in the middle, some people are interested in this, but both sides kind of think that this is going to happen by magic. The academics, they've done 1 or 2 papers on the topic. They're not going to be interested, for the most part, in the third replication of the same idea or different version of the same idea in a new setting. And conversely, the decision makers think that they can just take something from the academic literature, and we just need to tell them what it is, and they can take it up. So there's really this missing middle that was really the motivation for that report. Let's find those things that are not quite there, but that with a little bit of investment, a little bit of concerting effort, we can get there. That's what the motivation is. So how did we go about identifying those? How did we go about identifying this emerging intervention, which we call the best bets in the report? Basically, we at a.k.a. we have a bunch of sector programs, sector experts. Doesn't cover all the cause areas, so which is why the best bet report is not comprehensive necessarily of all the possible best bets you could think of. But we took those where we had a lot of internal knowledge, which is a fair spectrum already, and we sort of like looked at hundreds of papers, not just from a.k.a. but also from outside of what a.k.a. or JPAL would have been working on, and we classified them based on, of course, the strength of the evidence, the direction, but also more softer criteria. I mean, also the cost, but also softer criteria like, is there a potential model for this to go to scale? Like, can we picture how this could be implemented nationwide? Is it simple enough for us to be able to think that this could operate at scale, for instance? So also kind of like scalability consideration right from the onset. So identifying the promising interventions, classify the interventions, based on those ingredients and those criteria. I'll come back to this in a moment. In those three different categories: exploratory, emerging, established. Prioritize them, those that we want to invest more energy in, and then make sure that we made sure that we got a lot of external feedback from our scientific advisor, the academic communities we're connected to make sure that we had a bit of a sanity check on all of those ideas. Overall, through this process, we identified over 50 interventions. They're all in the report, but what the report focused on is this middle piece, because we think this is where there's a bit of a lack of attention structurally in the sector, whereas the exploratory and established intervention are listed with a fair amount of detail, but in the annex. So I'm going to delve a little bit more into the criteria, the ingredients, so to speak, that we had in mind when we to generate those categorizations, and in fact to find those 50+ interventions in the first place. And those criteria you can think of as some kind of ingredients that we think needs to be in place for something to be ripe, to be able to go to scale cost effectively. So one of the criteria is obviously strong evidence in the right direction, as consistent as possible across different contexts. So strong evidence with enough certainty, big impact, so the effect sizes need to be large. Low cost, although again very intuitive, a cost effectiveness argument. And then the couple of things that are a bit less of an academic exercise, but a bit more complicated to assess and a bit more of a judgment call, but still very important, are how simple is this to implement, and how much appetite there is out there to implement those kinds of things. It's one thing to want to implement, maybe you come up with a wonderful mental health solution, but maybe there's just no budget inside in developing countries for anything like that to be implemented. Even if the idea is awesome and effective, it's probably going to be harder. It doesn't mean it's not an important thing to do, but that makes it a bit less of a low-hanging fruit, a bit less of a best bet from a perspective to be able to predict when we're saying in 5 years we want to have new established interventions ready to go to scale. So that's a little bit of again, this is more of a judgment call here about whether there is appetite for this kind of interventions or ideas, or problem areas actually at the first place. So to summarize, I'll go to the list because I know you guys are all waiting for the list, so please bear with me for one more slide. The best bets hold particular promise for making an impact at scale. We're hoping that in 5 years, maybe 10 years, a number of them, not all, but a good number of them will get to the next stage of emerging and being ready and being solutions that can operate at scale cost effectively. But we think at this point, additional research and engagement is still needed, and it could be of different kinds. It could be, the intervention is awesome, we need to lowering its cost. We need to find ways to lower its costs. Or we need to optimize the interventions in different ways. The delivery is not quite there. We need to change the mode of delivery because it wouldn't be able to operate at scale the way it is. We need to simplify it maybe for government system. We need to think about how we would target it. So there's a lot of different possible questions depending on what the best bet is in particular that you could think of. On the impact side, maybe you want to, in some cases, you still need to do replication to check that in different contexts it would work as well. You want to look at indirect effects. You want to think about long-term impacts. We don't always have evidence of long-term impacts. So there's a lot of potential kind of more scaling research type questions that become very relevant for things that are at that stage. And now is the list. Drum roll, please. You don't have a drum roll? Thank you. So you're really cooperative. So this is the list. I'll go over it very quickly. In fact, no, I'm going to let you read it because I know you're not going to listen to me for 1 minute. So I'll just give you a few seconds to go through it, and maybe I'll describe it a little bit more. So one thing to bear in mind, and I got this question earlier today, and I think it's a very important one. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. We think it's a pretty good list, but this is those we identified in sectors that we know of. Earlier today, we were talking about family planning, which is a really promising area, I think, but we didn't have family planning expert in IPA, so that's the honest answer for why there's nothing about family planning here. So don't take this as a comprehensive list. Take this as a list of things that we think are worth going into and nothing more. In the health and nutrition space, there is, so 3 of them, small quantity lipid-based nutrient supplements, SQLNS, to treat malnutrition, will be very familiar to folks who are in the nutrition space. Mobile phone reminders for routine childhood vaccines, again, something that the EA community has picked up already, charity entrepreneurship in particular. Social signaling for routine childhood vaccines. I'll get a bit more into this one later. Education and early childhood development. Here you have teacher coaching is something quite promising and that integrates well with existing education systems. So, you know, if you can, there's some good evidence there. So if you can just get it right, it could actually unlock a lot of impact. Responsive care to promote early childhood development. This is those. The evidence is more about visits and coaching to parents, a bit of training to parents about how to interact with young kids aged 0 to 3 and how to stimulate them, how to respond to their needs. So here the questions are the open questions are about how to do it cost effectively, really, because that's quite expensive to do those one-on-one visits. But the evidence is quite positive on the effect size. Childcare for women, economic empowerment and child development. So here it's under early childhood development, but it could equally be under entrepreneurship. This is this idea that you know. It's very intuitive in the global north, but it's the idea that if women have a way for their children to be taken care of during the day, then they will be able to pursue economic opportunities. And I think the thing that doesn't either, you know, if you need to think about benefits in both for the child and both for the mother, for it to really be understood for you to be able to appreciate the full potential of that kind of intervention. That's something we're working on quite a bit on as well. In the IPV sector space, this is a very hard space historically to get. This is a massive problem. I'll talk about one of the interventions a bit later, but it's only recently that we're starting to see things that actually can move the needle in reducing intimate partner violence or GBV more broadly. One is couple counseling to reduce intimate partner violence through religious organization. I'll talk a bit more about this. One is about edutainment to change attitude and behavior. It's the idea of using entertainment, media, again, something that was picked up by, and there's one charity that is starting with that, from the Charity Entrepreneurship Program. It's about using those media ways to pass messages about gender norms, and it seems to be promising in terms of a way to reduce prevalence of IPV. In the entrepreneurship and private sector development, consulting services to support small and medium businesses, soft skills trainings to boost business profits and sales. Here, this is about the idea that you don't necessarily, it's not necessarily the most cost-effective to train entrepreneurs on accounting skills or things that are very technical to manage a business. What seems to be more promising is training them on entrepreneurial mindset, try things and fail, look for markets, like being more about soft skills, personal initiative kind of training than technical trainings on business practices. Social protection, livelihoods. There is this well-known program that also BRAC started, Livelihood for Adolescents. It's a package of intervention targeting adolescent girls, both about empowerment and livelihood. In the financial inclusion space, digital payment, I found that pretty interesting. Seems to have an actual effect on improving financial health of households. And now the questions are about how we make sure take-up is large and everywhere, as opposed to mostly for well-off population and urban areas. Climate and environment. Here, the idea is payment for ecosystem services to protect the environment. That's the one thing we came up with. And there may be others out there. This idea is basically paying people not to cut trees, compensating them for not cutting trees to increase their farmland. Seems to be a cost-effective approach based on some rigorous studies. The questions are about how you scale that up and how you do monitoring. All of this is kind of much more practical questions for how this could operate at scale. In the crime and violence space, one of the things that we found to be quite promising is the use of CBT. It's probably very familiar to you guys what CBT is about. In fact, I'll talk a little bit more about this right now. So, but here the idea is cognitive behavioral therapy, not in general to treat anxiety or depression, but as a way to reduce crime and violence. So I'll delve a little bit deeper on a few of those with the little time I have, but as I do that, I'll actually illustrate a little bit of what we think needs to happen on those. How do we get those to the next level? I'll take the examples of some that IPA is actually actively working on, but the intention of the report is we're not working on all 14, and the intention of the report is to really encourage others to either join us on some of the things we're working on, build coalitions, or call on us if we're not working on some of those, but also work on them themselves. Sorry. And what we think is needed, it really depending on each of the best bets. It depends on what the ingredients are that are missing on the current best bets, but it could be, you need more evidence synthesis and dissemination. It could be that you need more actual at-scale research. It could mean that you really need to work on the partnerships, develop new partnerships with government or other at-scale implementers. It could be, and we're working on some cases on this, that we need to do technical assistance on the scaling process or the M&E aspects of the scaling or what have you. And sometimes it's just the fundraising as well. Either fundraising internationally or fundraising within the country, get the attention of the Ministry of Finance or things like that. So delving deeper on a couple of examples, social signaling for routine childhood immunization. The idea is very simple here. This is giving a colored bracelet to the kid, to the infant, with a different color based on where they are on their immunization schedule. The idea is social signaling, and it's extremely cheap, as you can imagine. And in the one study that was done in Sierra Leone, we found that it has just that very, very cheap intervention increased timely and complete vaccination by 13 percentage points for just $1. So very, very highly cost effective. We need further research and partnership activities here because it's just one study to explore the generalizability to different contexts, especially in contexts where there is higher vaccine skepticism, where the social signaling might actually not be that effective, and maybe also to look into bottlenecks for government implementation. So we're trying to do a lot of these things. There's a massive program we're starting in Sierra Leone with the government to basically test a scalable version of this model within the system. And we're doing research. We have partnerships with various organizations that are working on that topic, and we're doing technical assistance to build the government capacity to run this kind of program at scale. Second example I'll go a little bit more deeply on is the CBT to reduce crime. So you know CBT, short-term pragmatic form of psychotherapy that prompts people to think differently and to change their behavior. Just a few sessions of this kind of psychotherapy. It's done in groups here. And here, it's a well-known intervention. In fact, I would argue it's an established intervention, even if it's actually not really operating at scale in developing countries. But here, this is CBT to reduce crime and violence. So you're targeting at-risk young men. There's a lot of violence and crime in many countries, in low-income settings, in fact, in high-income settings sometimes too. And you know, there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that CBT could actually be a cost-effective way to reduce that. There's even a study in Sierra Leone that we did, in Liberia, sorry, that showed sustained impact after 10 years. 10 years after the intervention. Cost is moderate, it appears to be cost effective, either if you do that alone or if you do that with economic opportunities like cash transfers on top of it. Similar cost effectiveness ratio. Here, the big problem we have is not so much about the evidence, it's more evidence or whatever, it's hard to think exactly about how you integrate that with a model at scale. And so we're working with an NGO that to see, right now the model is like, let's see if an NGO can scale that up in Nigeria. But there's no obvious implementer for this kind of thing at the moment. Other implementer at scale. And the NGO is relatively small, so we're also trying to look for avenue for it to work within the government. So it's not an established thing, it's like really a best bet in the sense, and the work for that particular intervention is like, let's find a model at scale that could deliver there. And maybe there's also, you could think of digital delivery for some of this, or there's a lot of different ideas you could have for this to be easier to implement at scale that would need to be tested. A third example I go into is Becoming One. So this is about reducing intimate partners' violence. As I said, it's a massive problem, extremely prevalent, even if very few people kind of know about this. By fairly credible estimates, it sounds like there is more than a third of women around the world that have experienced some kind of physical or sexual violence within their household, with their intimate partner, their own partner. So a very, very big problem, and very few solutions to address this up to very recently. And so in Uganda, the solution that was tested with a local church and the IRC was to basically use the existing couples counseling function that the church has through its ministers. They do on a regular basis, and many religious organizations do that, advise couples and train couples on various topics. And using that and integrating changing some aspects of your curriculum to get at gender norms or communications or financial management, ideas of sexual consent, mutual pleasure, getting that through the religious organization, through the minister, in the lens of religion, seems to have been an effective way to move the needle. So the cost is low because the programs already exist and you can leverage them. So we're trying to scale that up with that church in Uganda, but we're also we've been developing partnerships with other religious organizations in Kenya and Peru. Just to conclude, the Best Bet report, this is really a call to action for implementers, for researchers, for funders, to sort of like look at that missing middle, as I described it, a little bit more. So for implementers, maybe it's inspiring on those to tweak their program or to test new programs at scale, participate in research, maybe to strengthen those programs at scale. For funders, it's really about investing in resolving the remaining questions or supporting the policy engagement that needs to happen for those innovations to go to the next stage. And for researchers, it's obviously trying to, find ways to deal with your own academic incentives and make it and work on those sort of like emerging innovations that may not be at the frontier of innovation, but are very important to basically improve lives of people living in poverty cost effectively and at scale in the next 5-10 years. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
What are the biggest challenges you face when you try to scale interventions like this up?
I think if some people here were in Nila's talk earlier today, I think she would probably. I'm probably going to sound like I'm a repetition of what she said, because all that she said this morning was an awesome answer to that question. But basically, you have a few sets of problems when you're trying to scale those things. One is like actually convincing the folks who have sort of the decision-making power, that is often policymakers, that is sometimes funders, to adopt those programs. That's one area. Another one is another area of problem is when the organization is the capacity of the organization that is implementing those. So some programs are just too complex to operate through a government system, and so you have to just make that simpler and test whether the simpler version still works before you can scale them up. Then you also have issues of, even if the program is simple, you have issues of quality of implementation, what you refer to as fidelity of implementation. So the policy gets decided, maybe it gets implemented, funded, but then there's a lot of challenges in it reaching the last mile. In a lot of those cases, as you go to a bigger scale, you have just less control than when you have at the RCT stage when you're in a control setting.
Cool. Do you ever learn stuff from these scaling processes that leads you to abandon the intervention altogether?
So this is trying to consolidate the evidence into those best bets is a bit of and doing that in a structured way is reasonably new for us. But so I don't think, I'll tell you in 5 years maybe, but I think there's a lot of, there's some experiences. I don't expect all of those 14 to be established interventions, even in 30 years. I think this is a portfolio approach, if you will. I think some of those are going to get there, as many as possible, but some of them are not. And the sort of things that based on past experience, trying to scale other things up, some of the problems you're going to be running into are either aspects of the evidence, so maybe you could have that are not going to operate at scale. So maybe you can have generalizability, general equilibrium effects, where once everyone gets the intervention, then the intervention is just not as effective. You could think of that. Maybe a very simple example is cash transfers. If everyone gets cash transfers, you just create inflations. That's a theory. I'm not saying it's a fact, but that's like a way to explain what general equilibrium effect could look like. So at a small scale, when you're just testing a few people, you don't see inflation. But if everyone in the country gets $1,000, maybe that's all washed out in inflation. So there's like the evidence, and then there is like the fact that you're never able to. Another thing that you could see is like you're never able to simplify the program or make it cheaper in a way that maintains the effects of the original program. That could be another thing that happens.
Right. Someone actually asks, they say effect sizes are often much lower or zero when pilots are scaled. And can you talk about how this impacts the research into emerging areas?
So I think that's a fact. Lila talked a little bit about that this morning and had a good answer. My take on this is maybe a bit unconventional. I think 90% of the cases, when I read those papers of RCTs at scale that don't replicate the result of the smaller scale study, 90% of the case, it's an implementation problem. And so it was just not implementing well enough. So I don't think LCT research at scale is needed for many programs. It's needed in some cases when you're worried, you have a clear theory for why the program would not work the same at scale, like I just explained with the general equilibrium effects. There are other cases, other types of stories there. But by and large, when you look at those papers and deep down you dig at why those things didn't have the same impact or didn't have any impact, a lot of the time the implementation didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way it was supposed to happen. And for this, you don't need an RCT, you don't need a control group. You just do plain old monitoring of quality of implementation. So I think we're very keen and quick, and I'm IPA, so we're very keen and quick to jump to the RCT, but I think there's a lot of stuff that can be done in the absence of an RCT that are probably going to catch 90% of the problems that you get at scale.
When you're seeing those implementation problems, like, is there a particular type of implementation problem that crops up over and over again, or is it always just quite case specific?
I mean, maybe all of this is going to be sorted when technology is a much bigger place, takes a much bigger place in the picture. But you know, typically, what government, by and large, what Cleese Brutman was describing it this way. He was saying like 90% of development programs are about teaching people in rural areas how to live their lives, in some ways, or how to behave in some ways, whether it's teachers or whether it's you know, parents or what have you. You know, when you do a small scale study, you are one step remote from the trainer. When you do large scale studies, you're 2, 3, 4 steps remote from the trainer. And so if you do those monitoring studies where at the end of each stage of the cascade of training, you test the knowledge retention, you lose a lot at every stage. And so at the end, you just don't have much left. So I think that's one of the canonical types of problems that you're finding. It's very simple. You know, you get to bigger scale, you need different levels of training of the trainers, basically. And my hope is that with technology coming, you know, you don't have that problem anymore. You have other problems coming in, but I think there's at least a promise that you would not have those kinds of cascade training issues.
Right, that makes sense. Alex in the audience asks, in your view, what stops large existing NGOs like Save the Children from taking up one of your best bets and piloting it? It's often surprising they don't do it more often, given many of the best bets fit nicely within their existing programming.
It's a good question. Well, first of all, some of them do. I think some of them do, so we need to give them credit. I think, but still not as much as you would like. I think there's probably a bit of an incentive issue. There's probably a lot of different things. It's just my guess here. It's not based on evidence. There's probably a lot of different things happening. One is the incentives. Like if you're Save the Children, most of your money is coming from, you know, individual donations, unrestricted. It's not like anyone is really pushing you to adopt things that are cost effective. So, you know, whether you do it consciously or not, you're not trying to maximize your impact. You have a pressure to maximize. You're putting more emphasis on the fundraising or communication than the M&E or the selection of your program. A lot of them are still thoughtful. So again, like it's just in the background probably that they don't have as strong of an incentive as folks who are getting money from Gates Foundation, for instance. I think that's one of the things that might be happening. I'm sure people here can think of others.
Do you think it's easy or difficult for NGOs like those to actually get access to the information needed to know about these interventions in the first place? Like, how hard was it to put together this report? Because it sounds like a lot of work.
No, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, but like those large NGOs, they have the unrestricted fund, they have the units. They have like, I met with some of them, like they've been advocating for this kind of stuff internally, but those are large bureaucracies in the same way. You get your champions in the government. That doesn't mean that suddenly the whole government is going to implement only evidence-based programs.
Right. Someone asked a specific question about the SMS reminders for vaccination. They say there have been many studies and pilots of this, but no organization, to his knowledge, is doing this at a large scale. Why is that? What are the biggest challenges with scaling that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe because we haven't done enough of those communications with the right people. In fact, Charity Entrepreneurship started a program. In fact, 2 charities I'm hearing now. One, Suvita in India, another one that's starting in Africa to do this. They're not necessarily operating at massive scale yet. But I don't have a good answer to that question because I think that's a very easy, it's not an easy, it's a fairly easy thing to do, and it's a no-brainer. Maybe we need to talk to the WHO for it to be more of a standard for what they advise government to do. I think there's a bit of advocacy to be done on this. I think this is, a low-hanging fruit, yeah.
Right. How can we get more interventions from the exploratory stage to the emerging stage? Like, is there more work you'd like to see being done in academia or elsewhere?
Yeah. I think the incentives are okay. I think there are academic incentives to debunk a finding. The second study has some incentives. Maybe the third doesn't have as much. So I'd like, for sure, I would like for there to be much more thinking from the onset about what the scaling model looks like. So in the emerging studies, when you're doing your proof of concept of RCT, there are cases where you just want to do exploratory. It's like the hardcore R&D. But there are cases where you should already be thinking, is there any model that we can operate at scale and maybe test something that is a little bit closer to that? Maybe costing data is still a very big missing ingredient in some of those papers. We've been saying that for 20 years, but I think it's still very true that we don't have cost data, and therefore we don't do those easy comparisons that allow us to identify what those emerging interventions are based on that ingredient. So those are ideas that come to mind.
Okay. Another audience member, Kayla, says, given there is evidence to support unconditional cash at driving many of these best bet outcomes, how do you prioritize between exploring these new interventions versus cash benchmarking?
Well, actually, I think. Okay, so Rory yesterday described cash as it didn't really talk too much about cash as benchmark. He talked about cash as just what you should do. And I think, I personally think cash should be the benchmark. So if there are areas, so I think, basically in the question, I think you should explore that and have cash as the benchmark. And in fact, there are some of those studies where we're doing this. So in the graduation space, we consider this an established intervention, but we're really still trying to lower the cost of that of graduation, which is this massive package that I talked about of interventions with distribution of assets and whatever. And now we're doing studies to try to break it down, and we insist on having a cash arm, so cash only arm on the RCT when we're testing those different bundles to see whether it's worth continuing trying to do graduation or not. I think the jury is still out there.
Right. And last question then. When putting together this report, were there any problems you came across where there just is a lack of good bets, where you couldn't find stuff that seems promising to scale, and where more work is needed?
Yes, so the one that comes to mind is human trafficking. We have a whole sector area on this, and we didn't find any intervention that could make it to the best bet. There is a few in the annex on the exploratory stage, but that's a field that's a bit earlier in its sort of maturity in terms of use of generation of rigorous evidence. Because it's much harder to generate evidence there. I think things around conflicts are tricky as well. So we have a whole sector area that deals with conflict prevention. It's a tough one. We don't have a best bet other than the CBT for crime and violence, which is maybe somewhat related but not quite the same.
Do you think there's a reason why there isn't as much stuff in there?
There could be two reasons for that. One that I'm confident about is that this research is much harder to do, and therefore we started, as IPA I would say, but I think the field as a whole started really doing this kind of research on those topics in the last 5-10 years. So I think there's more of a timing issue, and I'm hoping that in a few years that there'll be more. Another potential explanation is that there's not going to be easy solutions, basically. That's a possibility, and I'm hoping it's not the case. One of those is the SME space, the growth. This one is tough. We put a couple of those in the report because there's such a large body of evidence around how to promote SME growth that we still put a couple that looked better than the rest. But this is really an area that is really hard to have large effect sizes on.
Right. Makes sense. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. There are still lots of unanswered ones. So there is going to be an office hours in Drake right after this. Strongly encourage you to come and ask. And yeah, please join me in thanking Loic for an excellent session.
Thank you. Thank you.